Hello, everybody. It's a big pleasure to be here again with another fantastic presentation. We appreciate, first of all, Dr. Suzanne Milliman to supporting this initiative, and we appreciate International Poultry Welfare Alliance for this collaboration that we're doing. I think this is our third or fourth webinar that we're doing. Dr. Hussein will be providing us a presentation about the key welfare indicators to improve animal welfare in layers. You can also find the PDF presentation in the IPWA webinar. And yeah, we're very excited. And as always, Suzanne will be presenting this presentation. And at the end, if you have any questions, guys, we will be more happy to answer them. And after this, the video will be uploaded in our platforms and will be free for everybody that want to see it again or share it. So, Dr. Suzanne, again, thank you very much for the time and your support on these initiatives, supporting the industry. So the time is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's been a true honor to be part of the IPWA program since some of the very early stages. And I am delighted to talk to you about laying hens that are near and dear to my heart. So the first thing when we're talking about animal welfare is clearly to define it. And thankfully for us, the definition of animal welfare has been already done, and IPWA wisely chose the widely accepted definition of welfare from the World Animal Health Organization, which is defining welfare in terms of the physical and mental state of the animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives. So by referring to animal welfare in this way, it is drawing the attention to the animal itself. So it's about the bird, and obviously the bird's welfare for animals that are under our control is heavily reliant on the people taking care of that. So, and providing animal care is complex. It requires customization to each species. And even within laying hens, it's particularly complex because we keep them for such a long period of time, and there's so many different housing systems and environments and different welfare challenges within each of those.
Sure.
So the IPWA recognizes there's many different standards for poultry welfare and is using the holistic approach of keeping the focus on the bird and what we can measure rather than being prescriptive in terms of what specifically we need to do. A couple of other key concepts about animal welfare I want you to keep in mind as we go through this presentation is that animal welfare discussions often focus on the challenges we're facing, but keep in mind welfare is on a continuum from very good to very poor. And so a lot of times the advances in animal welfare that we're doing, we haven't always had ways of talking about them. So that's where some of these KWIs are going to help us out. And also with all species, you know, an animal's welfare or its quality of life is a subjective concept by definition. So we can only measure it indirectly and do our best to understand and extrapolate what we think it means for that animal. In the case of the laying hens, the more you know about hens, the better you're able to interpret how she's thriving or faring within her environment. And folks that may not have as much experience with birds may make some assumptions that may not be correct. So these KWIs are going to be really helpful to show what it is we can measure, and then we can use that to improve performance over time. So the goals of those KWI guides are to encourage the global poultry industry to measure and share progress through the KWIs. In the case of layers, this is going all the way from the hatchery to the pullet rears to the breeders, and then transportation and processing at the end of life. It's a consistent reference for the supply chain and all stakeholders, so we're speaking the same language. And it's a leading edge information on what can drive improvements in animal welfare. So just to briefly outline IPWA, there's more than 500 individuals that are members of IPWA, as well as more than 85 organizations around the world. And then within IPWA, it breaks down into the research and education committees, health and welfare, and the board. And then, as I mentioned, it's going right from the whole bird's lifetime, from hatch all the way through until processing. So what KWI are first of all, outcome-based, where possible, measures of the bird, the flock, and the housing. It's considerate of all poultry housing systems and sizes, so it can be used here in the Midwest where I am today. It could also be used where my colleague is over in, for example, Uganda or over in Europe. So we're measuring the same types of things, but our challenges may be different. It's implementing for all different levels of welfare programs. It's inclusive of all regions and defined in a way that's accessible to those that are actively caring and managing the birds, as well as informing the stakeholders that are buying the products. They can be used to guide improvements for specific welfare outcomes. They can be used individually or together as a group, and they're packaged with implementation instructions and resources to ensure that the data can be used to guide improvements. And I'm going to walk you through a few examples of this. As somebody that's really been involved from the very inception of this concept, it's been a real delight for me to see how these discussions have gone from, trying to decide what should be included to not just having good descriptions there, but how to put it into action. What these KWI are not are prescriptive performance or compliance standards. So we're not telling you exactly how you should be doing something. We're telling you where you need to be, the sorts of things that you need to be measuring, and then within your system, determine what are appropriate thresholds. So as long as we're measuring it the same way, we have the same currency. It's based on theoretical recommendations. It's not based on theoretical recommendations. It's meant to be backed by science, but also with practical considerations. It does not apply only to particular regions. It is not applicable to advanced programs. It's not only applicable to advanced programs in well-developed poultry markets. You could be used across the board. It's not all-encompassing. It's very much a work in progress. So this is a start. And some of these KWI have been refined over time in many discussions. And it is not self-serving for the company's interests. So one of the values of being part of IPWA, and it's really exciting, is hearing people share what's working and not working. So as an industry, it can move forward rather than everything being proprietary. So why are these distinctions important? Input changes to production systems, such as being just reliant on engineering standards, do not always guarantee improvements in animal welfare because there's so much variability of what you see on farm. The influence of stockmanship by the growers and the producers have significant impacts on how those birds fare in the systems that they find themselves. And input changes provide a message to producers and consumers that if they're compliant with input requirements, it will guarantee good welfare. Here, we're wanting you to really look at that dynamic system of what is happening within this particular facility over time. So there's 3 different guides. I think that we're probably the last of the webinars. You may have already seen the turkey and the broilers. So you may see some repetition here as we go through layers. So they're not a set of requirements. They're flexible and customizable. They're a great reference that can be used, and you can modify them and personalize them to your own standards and guidelines and your personal goals of what you want to achieve at your facility. So these KWI guides include key welfare indicators that can be measured. You can monitor them over time, and there's ways to manage those to improve poultry welfare. And we chose these ones, or IPWA chose these based on which of these outcomes are going to most closely match with the bird's welfare. So remember, welfare ranges from good to poor. And we want to look for ones that are affecting most poultry in most systems, and also make sure that we're tackling the difficult topics that can have a substantial risk if they're not monitored effectively. So we do not give specific husbandry directions to this guide, but there's a lot of resources within IPWA on how to tackle and improve welfare if a challenge occurs. And I'm going to get into a couple of specific examples from the Layer KWI. So why was I asked to present this presentation? I want to first introduce my own bias, because we all come in with bias. So I'm very much an academic. I came through my entire professional career focused on animal welfare across species. And in my role at Iowa State, I'm in the veterinary college. My background is in animal and poultry science with emphasis on poultry, and my PhD was poultry. So birds are very much a key interest for mine. And then I also do some cattle work. So if any of you are at the beef meeting next week, you might see me there too. In my appointment, I'm involved with research, teaching, and extension or professional practice with farms. And my program is very, very practical. And some of the research questions that I have chosen to ask in my program directly relate to what we're talking about today, whether it's a basic issue of methods of euthanasia, or it's really tackling how we can measure welfare on farm rather than just in the laboratory. So this came up because I can't remember what call I was on, but we were discussing teaching. And I said, well, one of the things that I do is I use these KWIs all the time when I'm teaching students about animal welfare and with laying hens. So specifically, I teach all veterinary students at Iowa State in their first year about animal welfare. And I'll tell you, most of them are interested in dogs and cats, about half. And there's not as many interested in poultry, but this is a great example that I can use to get the students to understand basic ideas, and then also to follow through the evolution of how some of the basic science and concepts that they're learning about in this class then have translated as the industry has tackled with these issues of how do we actually fix it on farm, give us tools to try to address this and have a conversation. So the two things that I highlight to them is this welfare quality, which was some of the initial attempts to measure welfare on farm at an academic level more decades ago, and then how many of those same concepts were put and refined into what can actually be done on commercial farms by those actively using them. And so rather than going from an academic exercise, going into actually advising owners, and the students walk through that. And at the end of it, the students all learn the real world challenges of trying to capture a hen and handle her in a safe way, and the different ways that they can try to measure keel deformities and look at foot pads, and then troubleshoot of why do you think we're having these particular problems with this particular flock. So it's been a really fun journey for me. And so I can understand some of the challenges of putting this into practice with folks that aren't dealing with animal welfare every day the way that I do in my academic career. So let's dig into the layer guide specifically. It's really well organized and easy to navigate. And so a little bit of background about the guide itself and how it came about to be developed. But then depending where you are in the cycle, if you're on farm, you can look at the list of the different KWI that were selected and find the page numbers and relate to that. And one of the really helpful things that's within this guide is how they relate to each other, because you can't look at just one welfare issue in isolation, as I'm sure you're all well aware. So I'm going to walk you through a few examples. My bias is going to be evident here because I'm going to start with the ones that are near and dear to my heart, and knowing that we have limited time. So I always start with my student with the bird herself, given that animal welfare is about the bird. And it's not always easy to measure a bird's welfare, but one of the really good starting points when I'm talking to producers is mortality. It's a really straightforward KWI. It's something that producers are already collecting, so it's going to be in a comfort zone. And obviously, if an animal is not surviving, if it's dying, it does not have good welfare. So everyone, it's just intuitive that this is an important animal-based outcome of animal welfare. And so when we start off with flock mortalities, this would be the assessment of birds that died in the poultry house. So it's quite specific about where we are counting that data, and we can track it on the individual and flock basis and we can look at it over time, and we can also look at potential causal factors. So whenever you're looking at any of these KWIs, the first thing you'll see is a definition of what it is that we're measuring. And then I really like that it includes also some light bulb issues. Are you aware? So these are important things to consider, things such as regulations. So this has some reporting information that would be region dependent. So in the United States or in Iowa, I might have some particular requirements I need to be mindful of if I have catastrophic mortality. And that might differ from what my colleagues might have in another location. And then this also refers to differences between culling and euthanasia and mortality. So just getting some of the definitions here clarified. So elsewhere in the guidelines, we can talk about issues of culling and how that is separate from, but relates to mortality. I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. And our opportunity is to use an existing chart of common causes of mortality, or we can establish one ourselves to make it really personalized to give an insight to the welfare of the flock. And what it is we measure, pretty straightforward, right? We're going to measure the birds that die either on a daily or weekly level, and the locations of where those would be. So it may be just at the house level, or it may be within you might have it as specific as where it is within that barn or house. And one of the nice things that was done here and that made it so practical for commercial use is that the discussion of the units and how others are already measuring it. So again, with mortality, it's probably pretty straightforward to a lot of you that it would often be recorded daily. It's part of the daily chores to remove the deads and to be recording that somewhere. And that may get put into the database right then at the daily level, or it might be put into the database at a weekly level. But that's helpful to know, because when you go to look at how my farm is and my flock is performing relative to other flocks that we have had within this facility this year, or maybe in previous years, it gives me an idea of how I can track it and also how I relate my data to my peers. So we've got the active, dynamic, daily, and weekly mortality rates as that flock is alive, and then the cumulative mortality rate over the entire flock cycle. Again, one of the things that's a little different with layers than some of our meat birds is that it's really variable how long we keep that flock, especially at times right now when getting replacement pullets might be a challenge. So, you know, if the flock is performing well, we may choose to keep it going for longer. So then that cumulative mortality rate becomes a little bit, you have to keep that in mind when you're going to compare your cumulative mortality to others that may not be keeping their flocks as long as ours. And then breaking it down mortality by cause. So some caretakers are able to break that down and have an idea of what the likely cause would be. It's not a formal diagnosis because obviously you're not having a veterinarian that's walking through the facility, but there can be some basic information there, such as it was peck out or it was emaciated and so on. One of the challenges with layers is that if we leave them, you know, some of that ability to assess cause depends on how you've scheduled picking those birds up and how likely it is that you're going to get some cannibalism or interference by other birds in the flock. So if we're going to investigate further, we've got our data and I can look at it within my own records. And I may have been doing that already in terms of economic decisions and just planning of when I need to bring new birds into my flock. But if I'm seeing some unusual changes in mortality at particular times in the cycle, or potentially I've got a couple of houses that are all of a sudden that flock mortality looks a little unusual, then I can reach out to one of my resources, which might be a veterinarian that's within the company, or you may have at your university or extension agents, you may have veterinarians there that are consultants that you can reach out to do additional testing to try to diagnose what some of those causal factors are and try to catch that before it gets more severe than what it already is. So the specific ranges for mortality rates are not provided in the KWI guide, just because it is so contextual. It's going to depend on the age of that flock, what's happening, what the challenges are in your region. and regulations and so on. So it really isn't helpful at an international level to try to nail those down. The key thing is within your system, know where you are and how you can make successive improvements. So starting here, again, the guideline always gives you some information of if you want to take this on as one of the KWI that you want to include in your system, then here's how you do it. You start collecting and tracking your data. And to do that, you're going to have to train your workers in terms of how you want them to record that data. You may have a digital system, or you may be having that they just mark it off when they leave that house into the sheet that's on the door, a log record. You want to set up and evaluate the protocols. So implement scheduled regular analysis of that mortality data. So when are you going to look at it? Just putting it into the database isn't going to be enough. So figuring out that you're scheduling how you're using that data. And one of the things that sometimes is done is to assign particular workers that task. You're responsible for mortality. That can have the advantage of not only is it clear who is doing it so that everyone's not looking at everyone else of what is changing, who's tracking our mortality, but it also has some buy-in then, the folks that are in charge of that outcome, it gives them some personalized focus to the system. And it can also be helpful for some of the culture of the farm itself and the working team. And also helps with clarity of if someone's seeing some changes in mortality, to who do they need to let know that this is something that, just a heads up, we're supposed to be checking this once a month, but I'm just seeing this start to change now. An individual worker may recognize some of that, and it gives them an idea of who they need to turn to. In terms of improving mortality, you could increase what you're collecting in your data collection. So as I mentioned, some facilities, they just measure whether the birds were dead or not, and that's as far as they take it. But you could add some refinements there and determine every refinement is going to add some time, right? So you'll have to figure out, is this worth my time to have the staff slow down and add this additional information, such as where it was in the house and so on that data collection sheet. But once they're trained and they know how to do that, and if they're consistently giving you that information, it may be helpful. Doing some additional analysis, looking at how it changes over time, annual reviews, comparison with industry data, and then cross-referencing to other KWIs, because your mortality may be changing because there's some things that we're seeing in other aspects, and I'm going to get back to that. And then with all of this, if we want to make any progress with layer welfare, we have to measure it, but we also have to manage that and then see if our management interventions are effective. So we've done a change. Let's see if the data is going in the direction we would expect it to. And one of my comments that I added here is just in terms of language and culture. So mortality is a sensitive welfare issue, but it's also one that comes with a little bit of baggage when we're talking to non-producers, especially. So some of the discussion would be, if we're recording this with many of the across my species, production species, it's like, was this a death that occurred? And then was it an assisted death or an unassisted death? And so that's my bridge into the next section I'm going to talk about with culling. But the reason why we've been using the terms assisted and unassisted is that it implies a culture of care rather than it just being an inconvenience. So again, some of that terminology depends where you are. But keeping that in mind, because it affects just the farm culture, but also how people are communicating that same type of data. So let's move on to management-based measures. And I could also put this as human-based measures, because it goes beyond the managers of the farm right down to the people that are actively caring for the birds on a daily basis. So sticking with our mortality and the concept I just brought up of assisted and unassisted mortality, we've got this issue of culling cull tracking or tracking the culls or euthanasias. So the definition set up the same way as that last KWI, first explaining what this KWI is. So it's the assessment of the number and types of occurrences of euthanasia. And it provides insight into the welfare of the bird, the flock, and future flocks. And again, we've got a couple of our light bulbs of be mindful that there may be some regulations we have to keep in mind here, such as in the United States. We need to ensure that our methods of euthanasia are consistent with the gold standard, which is the American Veterinary Medical Association's guidelines. If your country does not have euthanasia guidelines specific to your country, then I would encourage you to use the World Animal Health Organization's terrestrial code, because they have specific information there about killing and culling of animals, of livestock. And so the relevance is that high cull rates can be an indication of a flock challenge. Low cull rates can suggest that the birds are actually doing really well, but you have to look at this and interpret it in terms of your dead in pen as well as your cull rate together. So I always worry if I don't see any of the birds being culled, because that may indicate that the workers either aren't trained to the euthanasia method, they may not be confident on when to do timely euthanasia, or it may just be a recording issue, that they're just failing to record that aspect of the data. So we can do daily cull tracking, just as we're removing the deads, just saying whether they were assisted or not assisted. It could be weekly or culling by category. Again, in terms of, so it's very similar in terms of what we're measuring as we would be for the mortality. But the reason why it's helpful to track the culling by category is that your staff may be recognizing particular reasons when culling is appropriate, and they may be failing to recognize timely euthanasia for some other welfare challenges or health challenges that may not be intuitive to them. So if we want to include this refinement or this additional KWI, then we would be collecting the data. So determining on our regular data sheets, observation sheets, how are we going to collect that data over time? Who is doing it? Similarly, you can have a specific person that's in charge of analyzing that data and making sure that it's done. And then analyzing that again relative to your industry norms and regional norms. And very similar to the mortality, the key is to look at the protocols, improve those if you're seeing anything that looks unusual or concern, and keep in mind that there's a lot of resources within IPWA members, and then there may be also regional consultants through the university system or private consultants or through your particular company that have particular expertise on euthanasia methods and some of these questions. So one of the refinements that I added to this one as well, and a lot of my research is in euthanasia, I can say even at our level where we're a little bit removed, doing basic science, particular students can do this type of work, staff and students, but it does have a psychosocial impact on them. So we're very mindful when we're doing the training and we have people actively involved that we're just keeping a finger on the pulse of that to see, is this the right person? So all of our team has to be able to understand the research protocol. They have to be able to understand it, comment on it, communicate on it, but not every person is the right person to be doing something like cervical dislocation or CO2 euthanasia. We have some folks that are better able to do that. And so just knowing within your team who is the right person and making sure that social support network is there, especially if you're having high flock mortalities and you have to do high culling. If you're used to just doing a certain percentage every day, that's one thing, but where you have to do a lot all at once, that can have a big impact. The third one I wanted to talk about is the resource-based measurements. And these would be things like engineering standards. So this is an example of our beautiful Iowa State University cage-free facility that's just going in, and we can have a beautiful facility that's designed with all the bells and whistles. But the key thing is to make sure that the engineers have designed that facility for engineering standards, which are absolutely important, but also with consideration of how this system changes when birds are in there and how the systems change when people and birds are interacting there. So it's a very complex dynamic system. The resource measure I wanted to refer to is air quality. And the reason why I chose this one was because if I'm looking at the bird's welfare over time, changes in air quality can affect every aspect of her welfare, her ability to function within her system. She may have trouble breathing. It can cause mortality issues. So if I look at the number of birds affected, if we have a problem with air quality, everybody in that flock is probably affected, and it can be over a long period of time. So when I'm choosing my welfare issues, that's how I decide which ones personally I'm going to put my emphasis on. This is one where we also have a lot of research data and some really excellent resources from the industry on how to manage this particular outcome. So air quality is the assessment of the characteristics of the atmosphere that the birds are breathing. Some key things to keep in mind: carbon monoxide levels can indicate lack of airflow or equipment that is needing service. Different heating systems also influence this, especially with ventilation rates and so on. And this is an interesting one in that as there's been a transition to cage-free housing, and we may have had welfare benefits for giving birds more agency to work within their system, we potentially have challenges with air quality as they are interacting with that litter and so on. So it's been interesting to work in this space with some of my engineering colleagues. In terms of how to measure, follow the instructions to assess the core areas of air quality. So there's different places that you could collect samples from, and making sure that you're getting a representation sample of the entire house. So getting into the different areas of the house. This can be done by measuring at the vents, but you want to make sure you're also measuring at the bird level and making sure your tools are calibrated, especially when you're in a dusty environment, because that can really influence your readings. So different types of measurements that can be taken would include ammonia and humidity, carbon monoxide or dioxide, those dust levels that can come from the litter, and airspeed, because we have the ventilation. But if the system's really struggling with that air quality, we have to keep in mind that that airspeed can also be an issue as well. And so a caution is that carbon monoxide obviously has a human risk factor as well, because we don't detect it. It's odorless. That's especially important when we're talking about brooders and we're at the pullet rearing phase, and being mindful of what the ranges of air quality are. So this is a case where there may be different regulations in the region where you are, but the science is there in terms of how it is impacting both caretakers and birds. So start here, set and evaluate your protocols. So figure out what you're going to measure and the sorts of tools and techniques that you may want to include. Some of them may be more costly than others. Some may need more expertise than others. And then gather that data and have a way of a planned way of how you're going to analyze that data. So here's an example of cage-free housing systems, as I mentioned, where we can get this challenge with when the birds fly down, we get the dust levels. And some of the stuff that's come out of Dr. Shin's lab and others is that, that change in that dust level really, when you look at it on 24-hour cycle, it really is influenced by when those birds are actually released and the lights come on and come down to the flock. So you want to keep that in mind in terms of when you're sampling, that you're capturing that, but you're also capturing at times when there's less activity to see how that system's clearing that particular air quality challenge. So to improve it, look at, can you improve how you're measuring this particular outcome, your frequency of collecting that data and your frequency of analyzing it, and then working with some experts, whether that's your ag extension agents, IPWA members that have this kind of expertise or expertise within your company to review your protocols with the current flock, but especially as well when you're thinking through, well, am I going to be doing a big investment in some capital down the road, and what are some of the things that have been a real challenge in this particular house or region. I'm, in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on a couple of the others, but only very briefly, because I really, I would love to spend the whole day talking to you about all of the KWIs, but it's obviously much more comprehensive and I want room for discussion. So transport and handling have been covered a lot in the meat bird guides. We also have that issue with layers, and one of the difference with layers is that we move them several times. So some of those animal-based outcomes that are able to be captured at slaughter can be captured with our layers, but many of our layers, as you know, aren't going through meat processing at the end. Some are. If they are, then you can refer to, and here there's a lot of that carryover from the broiler guide that equally applies to layers that are going through slaughter for their end of life. But we also have that transport from hatchery to the pullet house, and then pullet house to the layer house as well. And then if they're not going to slaughter, we have the transport and handling at end of life. So with all of that, there's a big section in the guide that I'd encourage you to look at for that. And as I mentioned, there's some of those birds that are going to slaughter. All of them are going to be starting as chicks. And one of the things I really love that we put into the KWI is the discussion of chick comfort. So often with welfare, I said we focus on the negatives. One of the things the dairy industry did really well was take that term cow comfort and really draw from that and have pride in what they're providing. It's a great communication tool, and I think it's honest. So when we're talking about our chicks or our hens, I'd encourage you to think of the term comfort, chick comfort. What does it mean? We can use vocalizations. We know that the chicks are going to need warmth. So we can look at their behavior to judge the temperature within the house. Lots of really practical experience that you guys have as well, and that are in a variety of different extension resources. So we can be tracking these as well. And I'm sure you probably are. So the refinement that I'm adding is to encourage you to use some of the terminology that we've got in the KWI guide for layers here. And injury tracking is one of our big challenges with layers. There's a lot of discussion about keel deformities and keel fractures. Also with leg quality, you know, whether they've got foot pad dermatitis or they've got fractured toes or bumblefoot, all of those are really important for layers, especially in cage-free systems, because they need to be able to navigate. And one of our big challenges is, how do you assess that without having to capture a bird so that you can manually palpate it? Because that's a welfare challenge in itself. So I'm excited about some of the technologies that are coming through from our computer engineering folks to try to see, are there ways we can automatically and remotely track some of this information. So I hope I've convinced you that it's worth taking a look at the KWI guides and seeing how you can use it. So if we start down at the bottom of this triangle of welfare improvements, we know welfare knowledge drives the initiatives through the supply chains that can improve welfare. And it's really a win-win-win for the birds, our purchasers, and the people caring for the birds, and the purchasers of our products at the very end. So one of the advantages of using these KWIs is, rather than it telling you exactly what you need to do, it's saying, here's the currency, here's our language, and so that you can explain where you are in terms of the welfare spectrum. The key welfare guides are now in Spanish, and there are active translations in Thai, French, and Portuguese. And there are online learning modules. I know Elena and others from IPWA can give you more information about that, but I know there's some really great ones for the laying hen side that are in production right now and will soon be available. So lots to share. And here's the contact information for the Ryan Bennett and the IPWA team. I'd be happy to take any questions at this point. And discussion.
Suzanne, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I think that it was very simple and accurate. Is something that we're looking for. Me personally, I have a question. I know that you're coming from the academic and in some slides you present some challenge, how to implement some measures and how to implement some protocols in the commercial farms. Let's put it in that way. You show very nice picture of your facilities where you test things and where you do some research. But what's your experience in coming from the let's say academics and trying to implement these protocols in the commercials, knowing that also that will involve some capital, some finance, different costs, and I may think that in some time there will be some let's say precaution from the companies that they would like to go in this way, but also they need to have some budget, because
Absolutely.
that's I think that realistic what sometimes happen in some markets. So I really would like to hear your experience and how can you explain this to the people getting to these programs.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Oops, excuse me. Thank you for that question. And I love this question because as I said, my entire career has focused on animal welfare, and I love teaching the students because what I say to them is when I first came in this area, I thought it was just as simple as you just need to tell people how it is and it will get fixed, right? It's just so naive on how complex the issues were if we were all
Yeah.
looking at the same thing. And what I say to the students is you have specialized knowledge about a narrow set of things. And animal welfare change requires us to come to the table and each feel comfortable sharing our limited expertise of things and to listen to others. And so you can put forward some ideas and you need to be clear about what is
Hmm.
known and not known. Not everything is known. We haven't done research on every animal welfare issue. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And we have to be honest about where there's uncertainty because these are people's livelihoods and they're going to make a decision that is going to potentially impact them for decades. So I'm cautious and try to be really clear about what I do know and what I don't know. And one of the things that's been really rewarding for me, as in IPWA and being part of these discussions, is learning so much every day when I'm on farm or in a discussion with others in IPWA about what are the practical challenges of implementing, what are you seeing that's different? Because there's a lot of really practical changes that don't have to be redesigning an entire facility, but can make real changes. And just as a really simple example, I mentioned Uganda previously because I've been there several times. And I would say to my colleagues there, your welfare challenges are not necessarily the ones that we have here. So mortality and getting the birds away from parasites might be your number one thing. Whereas, you know, in the United States where I am in this particular region and the market, the focus may be keel deformities and keel fractures. So just really listening and recognizing there's lots of different aspects to poultry welfare and how that links into one welfare or human welfare.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Megan Hain. It says, thank you so much, Dr. Millman and the IPWA team. What a great resource. Do you know if any other species industries have done anything similar?
Similar to IPWA.
Well, I don't know. It's just the question, maybe
Yeah,
yes, or maybe similar to this
sure.
broad vision of animal welfare.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's interesting knowing the history of animal welfare challenges. Laying hens were the first farmed species that got a lot of attention and where a lot of the regulations came through internationally, if you look. So in many ways, the folks working in the laying hen topics have been working for a long, long time. The other commodity groups or animal production groups have also worked on this area and have, you know, there's a lot of synergy on where folks have ended up and in different ways. So for example, with the swine industry in the United States, they came up with a common swine industry audit with a somewhat similar program where processors or purchasers and producers and veterinarians and so on came together and came up with a guide with animal-based outcomes without being really prescriptive. But for other commodity groups and other countries and so on, they may have had more of an input guide of this is what you should do. So each country is a little different, but as we're using the same types of outcomes, animal-based outcomes or KWI, we have a common language and currency to see how we're using things. Is my standard the same as yours? Really important when we're talking about importing, exporting products and different regulations. Just having regulations don't mean they're enforced and don't mean that they necessarily hit the right issues. So I think this is really exciting to see how all of the poultry groups came together in IPWA and have really standardized this and tried to have this international collaboration.
Okay, great. Megan, provide a little bit more information about the question, but I think that you already answered something. So Megan, add the question is, have you done something similar? And she had something, focus on defining key welfare indicators or clear measures of welfare. I think that you covered a little bit about this, right?
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'd add, Megan, is that this was also a focus of the World Animal Health Organization, or OIE, because when they were tasked with taking on animal welfare, initially it seemed straightforward just to give recommendations of you should do this, this, and this, and they quickly recognized that's not the approach. So across the different types of animal challenges, and these aren't just food animal, this is also stray dog population control. They really came up with, here are the outcomes that you should be measuring that relate back to welfare. So whatever program you implement, here are some consistent things that you could be measuring that are important for welfare. So I think we're still on the cusp of figuring this all out. And I'd say poultry is certainly one of the leaders of that.
Okay, perfect. We have an anonymous question saying, does the reference guide cover pullet welfare beyond the first week in the same way for laying birds?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Okay, so here's the next question for a anonymous guest. Does the guide cover the pullet phase
Yeah.
the first week in the same way of the laying birds?
In the same way as they would on broilers, you mean?
Yeah, huh?
Yes,
In
yes,
the first,
yes.
okay.
As I said, I was only able to discuss a few of those animal welfare, KWI. And so I just touched on the chick welfare piece of that. So there's discussed some of these same ideas, such as injury tracking. You could do this with the mature flock, the laying flock. The injury tracking, some of those same concepts of developing the protocol and gathering that data, you can do with the pullet flock as well. And similarly with the transport, as I said, we've got these multiple points of transport, and the way your protocols may differ in some ways, but you can be tracking those same types of outcomes across the system so that we can be communicating as the layer industry. If we were talking about DOIs during transport, we'd want to talk about it hatchery to the farm, pullet farm to the layer farm, and then layer farm to processing.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And there's also information from the hatchery. So that's a really good question. And some of those are specific and some of those we can carry over. So mortality and culling, you would see those at all of those different stages of production.
Okay, Tommy Reedy Kalakota from India. Happy animals is happy business. Thank you a lot for valuable information, Professor Reddy from India. I'm very glad that our audience can recognize the effort that we're doing in in all ways. Okay, I think this is the last question from our audience. I have one more for you, Suzanne. After seeing your presentation and seeing the way that you speak and seeing your bio, all the work that you have done with animal welfare, I can see your passion and I can see your interest in this subject. So my question to you is, what's your dream for the next 5 years? For the next 5 years, something that you really would like to happen in the industry regarding animal welfare in your heart. What will be that thing that you will be expecting to happen in the next 5 years, just for putting some measure?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm seeing many changes and improvements in poultry welfare because we're getting these scientific advancements, and especially the communication and getting some of those on-farm studies, I think, are very exciting. So I think that's already happening. And I'm confident that that's going to improve our ability to make changes. The thing that would be my dream and my goal is I'm a scientist and an educator. I love birds and I love eating eggs. And so I think the key thing that I would love is seeing the more communication between and confidence in communication between people that are producing eggs across the spectrum and their ability to talk about bird welfare with the people eating their end products, and using the terms like recognizing I need to talk about the bird. So rather than both sides getting polarized and defensive, it's like some of these and thinking through how the terminology we use and how that may be either bringing people together at the table, or it may be defensive. It might work in a moment in time to shut somebody down, but it's not encouraging them to trust you. And I think I in 5 years, I want to see more trust and more conversations. Yeah.
And that needs a change of breaking some thoughts paradigms
Yeah.
that we
It
have
takes,
today, right?
yeah.
Huh?
It means putting yourself out a little bit, and yeah.
Of the normal, of the common. So okay, thank you very much. We reach almost 52 minutes of this conversation. This is what really excites us about these webinars, and first of all, having all your knowledge, and then having the opportunity to chat a little bit with the audience and putting some thought together. So Suzanne, thank you very much. We appreciate your work. For the audience and the people that will be seeing this video later, we will share your information so people can find you if they need something specific. And thank you again to IPWA for doing this, putting all this together. And yeah, we're gonna keep pushing and working in this way, Suzanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone giving some of their time. I know how valuable that is.
Thank you. Bye-bye.